Alright, welcome back to part 2. We're going to start off with part 2 of our nuclear energy, talking about the nuclear fuel cycle. So the first step of this nuclear fuel cycle is that you have to mine uranium. And this uranium is low grade ore. It is very low grade. So naturally occurring uranium contains about 99.3% of uranium-238. And only 0.7% of this uranium-235, and the 235 is what we want. So we have to enrich the uranium to 3% to produce weapons grade material. So the material is fabricated into a powder. So we mine it and then we fabricate it into a powder, and then we turn that powder into pellets. And these pellets are sealed into the metal rods and lowered into the reactor. So this is the beginning of the nuclear fuel cycle. To continue this nuclear fuel cycle, we need to have fission occur. So fission is going to be occurring inside those rods, and the uranium-235 concentration is going to decrease. So what that means is every 3 years of operation, the fuel rods won't have enough radioactive material anymore, so then it can't sustain that chain reaction, which is the whole way we capture, release that energy, and then heat up the water, so then heat up the steam, which then turns the turbine, which then we have power. So if we don't have that chain reaction, thus the spent fuel rods are replaced by new ones. So that's what we have. Now here's an opportunity for those uranium rods to be recycled. In the U.S. we don't do this. It's called reprocessing due to basically the constraint and the threat of nuclear proliferation. But in Japan, India, Russia, France, and the UK, they reprocess these rods so then they can use them again. And this is as opposed to storing the spent fuel as nuclear waste. So they are able to essentially recycle with a lot of money, and the U.S. chooses not to do that. So some of the problems with radioactive waste disposal and accidents as well as thermal pollution. So there's a high-level waste, and at this time, no country has a permanent storage solution for high-level waste. No country. Basically, how can you store something that's super dangerous for 240,000 years? There's a waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico that's beginning to collect some of this waste in March of 1999, but this is only the beginning. Another thing that the U.S. does is at Yucatan Mountain, Nevada, they send their at this location they accept spent fuel from nuclear reactors, and so we're currently storing them there. Nevada did not want this to go in, but the federal government pushed its way through and had it happen. And the current waste produced by nuclear power plants already exceeds the storage capacity of this site, so this is not a long-term solution. So here's a picture of that Yucatan Mountain diagram of the Yucatan Mountain. So here's the entrance here, and these tunnels have where the storage of the nuclear waste is, and notice that it's 300 meters from the top and 300 meters from the water table. So the idea is that this is a relatively ideal location for storing, although what I've already mentioned that we have more waste than storage, so that's a potential huge problem. So there are some accidents with nuclear power. The first one is 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. This happened on March 28, 1979, and this was a partial core meltdown. There were no deaths, and it was very little radiation vented. However, it was a public relations disaster. The next nuclear disaster was Chernobyl, Ukraine, and this happened in 1986. And here a reactor exploded with no containment building. There were 31 immediate deaths. There were 24,000 evacuees receiving high doses of radiation. Thyroid cancer in children went exponentially high. And today there are 400,000 people who have been evacuated from their homes, still to this day. So the degree of damage can vary with the radiation form as well as the duration and dosage. If your body cells, so anything besides sperm and egg cells, the only person who will be infected by exposure to radiation is yourself. But if your sex cells are radiated, then that mutations are going to be passed on to your offspring. Because mutations are permanent, radiation effects may build up over years and only appear later in life. And most common cancers are linked to radiation exposure are leukemia and breast cancer. And human exposure usually expressed in reams, so the measure of biological damage to tissue is this reams number. The additional of waste heat to the environment when cooling the moderator fluid is called thermopollution. This is especially dangerous in those aquatic systems, and I talked about how the cold water is taken in and then the warm water is released, and that other power plants have thermal pollution problems as well, but not as much as nuclear. So nuclear is a special star next to this. So in 1957, the Price-Anderson Act was passed, which basically covers all non-military nuclear facilities constructed in the United States. The Act established a no-fault insurance type system in which the first $10 billion of an accident would be funded by the industry. And then any claims above $10 billion would be covered by the federal government. Note that this is really peanuts in comparison to an accident, so the federal government sort of left holding the bag. So today there are 440 power plants supplying 16% of the world's energy. If nuclear energy based on uranium-235 increased enough to provide 40% of the world's energy, all the uranium deposits that are available on the planet would be used up in 30 years. So currently 1% of the uranium is being used in the reactor and 99% ends up as heat waste. So our current nuclear reactors are really part of a nuclear waste problem, not a long-term energy solution. So some future possibilities include this breeder reactors, which turns uranium-238 into plutonium-239, and it could provide half the energy provided by fossil fuels for 2,000 years. Another thing is fusion, not fission, fusion, combining the nuclei of heavier elements, for example, hydrogen into helium. In order to do this, the temperature really needs to be high. We currently cannot control this reaction at the temperature. In addition, potential energy available when and if fusion reactor power plants are developed in the are nearly inexhaustible. So with anything, there's a risk analysis, and the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the risk analysis on nuclear energy, estimates that the threat of a large-scale core meltdown in any year is 0.01%. In other words, it's one chance out of 10,000. If the number of nuclear reactions increases up to 1,500 reactors at 0.101, a meltdown would happen every 7 years. So to go back to Chernobyl, the reactor failed there because of human error, and the reactor core temperature reached a temperature of 3,000 degrees Celsius. And Chernobyl released over 2,000 kilograms of uranium-235. To sort of put that in perspective, an atomic bomb at Hiroshima released 25 kilograms of uranium, so more than the atomic bomb. 3 billion people in the world received radiation because of this. With the exception of the 19-mile zone surrounding Chernobyl, most of the human exposure was relatively small. So 115,000 people were evacuated from the Chernobyl area. A town 2 miles from Chernobyl is still evacuated. That's 48,000 people who have not been able to go back to their homes. An estimated 16,000 deaths were the result of this accident. Voles that have been studied since the accident for gene mutations, the voles contaminated zone have mutation rate over 5 mutations per animal compared to only 0.4 per animal outside the zone. So clearly there is a direct correlation there. Advocates for nuclear power argue that the number of deaths per year from coal, oil, and natural gas caused by air pollution is greater than 60,000 that might be attributed to the accident in Chernobyl, so that's a pro or the advocates of are saying. Nuclear material and waste production, the environmental cleanup is the single largest item for the Department of Energy's budget. So once a nuclear power plant has come to the end of its life expectancy, which is 30 to 40 years, the decommissioning begins. And the decommissioning costs are pretty ridiculously high. So unlike other power plants, nuclear plants are decommissioned, not demolished. In 2005, 68 of the 104 U.S. plants were at least 20 years old, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission may extend the authorization an additional 20 years depending on the plant. When getting ready to decommission a plant, utility companies have three options. They can do decontainment and dismantle, which is remove everything as immediately. You can do a mothball, which is a plant is shut down for a short period, allowing the radiation to dissipate and then dismantle. Or you can do an entomb, which the plant you basically surround the plant in concrete. That used to be our #1 option here, but now people are seeing that is actually contaminating the groundwater, so we're not doing that as much. I'm going to let you just read over this to get to the next slide. So this is an important figure for the formation of plutonium-239. Notice that the protons and neutrons change. That's pretty key. So here a neutron hits the uranium, and then uranium loses an electron, and then we change the protons and neutrons again, and then we change the protons and neutrons again, eventually ending in plutonium-239. Finally, low-level waste includes cooling water from the nuclear reactor material from decommissioned reactors, protective clothing like materials, and prior to 1970, the U.S. placed 50,000 barrels of low-level radiation waste on the ocean floor. In 1970, there was a moratorium, and in 1983, there was a ban in this practice.